So, as we said in our last segment, the cause of suffering is not that reality is this imperfect, insubstantial, empty, and impermanent entity, but the combination of that with this inherent desire to cling to an absolute and perfect reality that doesn't exist. And so, this attachment that causes suffering, whether through desire or hatred, actually is produced by a fundamental ignorance of no self. Now, why would the belief that there is a self be the basis for attachment? Well, think in the positive sense of desire. You are all, for example, striving to get a degree, aren't you? You desire that piece of paper at the end of your education, that BSN, for those of you who are listening to this for that particular thing, or your degree at Salve. And what are you striving for? You are striving for something that you will enjoy in the future, don't you? So your desire and your striving for it to achieve this goal, this attachment to a degree, is in fact presupposing a fundamental truth, that you will be there to enjoy it. That there is a you that's expecting it and hoping for it, and that you will be there to be fulfilled with the enjoyment or the attainment. That the future being that walked across that stage is the same being that's now hoping and desiring. Same thing with revulsion, right? With lack of attachment. There you're fleeing because the thing that you hate is the thing that you think will cause you suffering. And so you have this expectation that if you get too close to this thing, then you will suffer. And so the presupposition in all attachment, in all clinging, is that there is a clinger to cling to something, that there is an enjoyer to desire enjoyment, and that there is a sufferer to suffer the suffering. The minute you release the idea of a self, the minute you dissipate and there is no self, then there can be neither suffering nor enjoyment. There can be no attachment because there's no attacher. Thus, the key thing to realize is no self. But is it true? That would be great if it were true, but we're philosophers here. How do we prove that really what we think is a self isn't really a self that survives or that exists in the first place to survive over time? Well, his basic argument I framed here on this side of the board. If there is a self that endures, then it's an individual thing, isn't it? It's an ego, an I, that survives over time. Because when I desire something, I know that I'm looking to be there in the future to get it, to grasp it. And so, therefore, what I'm believing exists is a self that endures over time. And if there is such a thing, then something has to remain unchanged within me, right? If everything within me that is presently desiring something were to change over time, so that nothing remained the same, no part of me remained the same, then it would be kind of like a ship that every plank is changed, so that in the future, there's no part of the old ship that still exists. Would we really say that's the same ship? It's hard to believe that we would. And if we did, we would only be saying it in a very loose sense, right? As in a descendant of an earlier ancestor. And so, thus, if there really is this Atman, this soul, this self, this I, some part has to remain unchanged to be the enjoyer of the future enjoyment or the sufferer of the future suffering. But what the Buddha is going to prove is that, in fact, no part of the thing that we say is ourself remains unchanged. Every part changes constantly. And so, therefore, There is no real self. Now, here's the crucial thing. He has to show this by getting us to admit what the nature of this thing we call the self, our existence, really is. And when we think about it, we realize that what we call ourself is our consciousness. What do I mean by that? Well, think about the example of Terri Schiavo. Some of you might remember Terri Schiavo. She was in a terrible accident that then led to her becoming in this permanently vegetative state. Her body survived, but her consciousness, her brain activity was completely cut off. And there was no way for her ever to recover consciousness. Now, most of us would believe that without consciousness, there is no self. That the self is the consciousness. That if you were to say, okay, your self continues, but with zero consciousness for eternity, we would say that's no different than if we were to die. The only difference is our body remaining, but I'm not my body. If I'm going to survive, I want my consciousness to survive. I expect a future state of consciousness for myself. So cut off all consciousness and you cut off the self. The way the Buddha put it is, without thinking, there is no thinker. So some of you might have read the famous philosopher Descartes, who said, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And thus argue that this shows that there is this self, there is this ego, because thinking is going on, there must be a thinker. The Buddha wouldn't disagree with that, but the Buddha would say you can also put it the other way. I don't think, and I'm not. And so therefore, what really is truly myself is some form of my consciousness. Cut off my consciousness, and there is no me to be conscious. So, what is this consciousness then? Well, the Buddha divided it into what are called the 5 skandhas, the Panaskhanda. And skandha is best translated as an aggregate or collection of things, or literally a heap, like a heap of sand. So what you see here already is this idea that consciousness is not this single entity, but is a complex team of things put together. So already we see that we don't have this absolute I. But maybe that absolute I is the one part of consciousness that remains the same, and therefore every other part can be attributed as the effects of it. So we have to investigate all aspects of our consciousness. And if you notice, these 5 skandhas I have put in a circle because all of them are mutually dependent on each other and give rise to each other. Again, this is the idea that our reality is always conditioned by other reality. It's never absolute. And when we understand this, we see that the Buddha is right. So what is the Buddha doing? He's using observation. He's using self-observation and saying, what do we perceive ourselves to be? If Descartes tells us, he didn't know Descartes, I'm imagining a conversation he might have with him. Descartes tells us, I think, therefore I am. We have to use the nature of our thinking to determine the nature of the I that thinks. And because that is what alerts us to our existence. So, imagine, for example, my son when he was about 4 years old. I remember because we were doing some work on our kitchen, and as we were doing that work, we tried to shield the kitchen by putting one of those little baby doors things that are supposed to keep the child out of the kitchen, but he was a pretty smart kid, and so without us looking, we weren't paying attention for a couple minutes, and he somehow got in the kitchen, and as a good 4 or 5 year old does, hurtles unthinkingly and unobservingly through the mess of wood and nails. And what happens? Well, he steps on a nail. All of our thinking, all of our perception, all of our consciousness depends on consciousness of something, doesn't it? Well, that of is whatever we're conscious of has some direct form or matter to it. It's concrete. And so the nail is the matter or form. That is the basis for the sensation that that nail causes. When he steps on the nail, he doesn't know that's a nail. All he feels from his contact with matter or form is a sharp sensation. And then what does he do? Well, he looks for the source of it, doesn't he? Trying to understand or focus on that sensation and grasp that sensation. When he does and gets a name for it, then he perceives the nail, doesn't he? Sensation is just the feeling without the perception, without the recognition. Perception is, oh, I see a nail. Stimulus, response, recognition of what the sensation is. That's perception. Well, once he recognizes, now he's going to want to respond, right? Then ideas form. That's a nail. Or for him, ow, that hurts, that sharp thingy. And these ideas then form beliefs. Beliefs that, for example, these nails are terrible things. I don't like them. And therefore volitions and desires and hatreds come out in response to that. And these volitions and desires lead to actions. But in all of this is presupposed through the recognition and the mental planning, this idea of consciousness itself as the basis for all this. In other words, then he's like, I'm in pain, therefore I am. He becomes conscious of his consciousness. And it's through that basis of consciousness, often translated as the mind itself, that becomes the storehouse for all of these sensations, perceptions, and volitions, that it's possible for us to get an idea of matter and form, and therefore to have sensation, to therefore have perception, to therefore have these responses, these ideas and beliefs and volitions and desires and hatreds, and therefore to have this consciousness of self. So, therefore, we see the total nature of our conscious self. We are this combination, this aggregate of matter, sensation, perception, beliefs and volitions, and consciousness. Now we have to ask ourselves, are any of these things unchanging? Obviously matter isn't. Even your body changes, so that no cell in your body has the exact matter that it had 7 years ago. We know this medically speaking. Are your sensations always the same? No, they're constantly changing because the reality around you is constantly changing, and your sensation is just the stimulus that the reality or environment is giving you. If that changes, then your sensation's changing. But then if your sensations are changing, since they're the basis for your perceptions change. You're constantly seeing new things. You're constantly learning new things. And therefore your ideas and your desires are constantly changing, aren't they? So that none of these can be you. The candidate that we might think is the mind, right? The basis for all this, the thing in which all these things exist. But that self-consciousness itself, even though its change is harder to see, is changing. Think of it like this. Imagine a newborn baby. Does a newborn baby have this consciousness of consciousness? Are they self-aware? Are they not only aware of the marker, but that there is consciousness of the marker? No. Doesn't that grow by degrees? And so since consciousness grows by degrees, then it changes, doesn't it? It's not the same as it was yesterday. As you learn, your consciousness changes. Not only does it change in growth, but it changes in old age, doesn't it? So say someone gets Alzheimer's or dementia, then what happens is a diminution, a decreasing of consciousness of self, right? Of the thinker, of the mind. And so therefore, that constantly changes too, though we're not always aware of it. Because if things grow or go down, you may not always see the growth or the going down, but it has to be changing even when you're not seeing it, otherwise it would remain the same. So, therefore, no part of what we call ourself, our consciousness, remains the same over time. It's constantly changing. And it's a group. It's not an individual. They're aggregates. All of them together might be the me I think I am. But when I realize that all of them together are a group and not a single thing, why would I call it a self? Why would I call myself an individually existing, substantial thing? And so, there is no self. The total basis for belief that there is, when we think more analytically about it, we realize that it is empty. And that's dukkha, isn't it? Is the illusion that something has this absolute existence, but it doesn't. So when we come to realize this, that is then the true key to the third noble truth, the truth of the cessation of dukkha, of suffering, which we will talk about in our next section.